the digital resources. Okay, so I'll start again. Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica Dermisich, the college's digital archivist and records manager, and I am representing the Committee on Diversity and Community today. And I'd like to start this event with a land acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge that Williams College stands on the ancestral homelands of the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohicans, who are the indigenous people of the region, now called Williamstown. Following tremendous hardship, after being forced from their valued homelands, they continued as a sovereign tribal nation in Wisconsin, which is where they reside today. We pay honor and respect the ancestors past and present as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. Williams Reads aims to foster new connection among students, staff, faculty, and community members by exploring diversity through a common reading experience. Developed by the Committee on Diversity and Community, the CDC, Williams Reads is an initiative offered as an opportunity for us to explore a book together that will help us celebrate and deepen our appreciation for diversity. It is the goal of the CDC to select a book that will stimulate community engagement and create challenging conversation. Our 2021-2022 book is Ebony and Ivy by Craig Stephen Wilder. And today we are holding a panel with historians who have engaged in distinguished work examining how higher educational institutions have been implicated in histories of racialized violence. Our panelists today include Stefan Bradley, Professor of Black Studies and History at Amherst College. Professor Bradley authored the wonderful Upending the Ivory Tower. Lynn Rainville, Director of Institutional History and Museums at Washington and Lee University. Professor Rainville authored Hidden History, African American Cemeteries in Central Virginia. David Varel, Adjunct Professor of History at Metropolitan State University-Denver. Professor Varel is the author of The Lost Black Scholar, Resurrecting Ellison Davis in American Social Thought. Many of our panelists' works are available for sale at our Williams bookstore on Spring Street. Head there to see a great display on books that examine institutional histories in higher education. Also, please go check out the Williams Reads exhibit, Spaces, Places, and Names in Special Collections. The exhibit's also a pop-up both in Scow and Sawyer by the new releases. Our moderator today is the fabulous Jackie Hidalgo, Associate Dean for Institutional Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Chair and Professor of Latino Studies, Latino Studies and Professor of Religion. I will turn things over to her now. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the incomparable Jessica Dermisich, and you should definitely go check out the exhibition. She and her colleagues and some students did an amazing job. If you're around, you should go see them. Thank you for your welcome. I also just want to offer some gratitude to some specific members of the Committee on Diversity and Community who've really done a lot of behind the scenes work that you may not see. Anthony Purnell McGee, Clinton Williams, Essence Perry, Valerie Bailey Fisher, and Jen Zielinski. So thank you all so much for that incredible work. And Essence Perry is a student, so you should know that she's done the impressive work of an already brilliant administrator. I'm excited to hear more from these terrific scholars who agreed to participate in Williams Reads here in 2022. And I'm sorry that it has to be virtual, but I think it opens up a lot of options as well. So I'm really grateful that you're here. Just a few notes about our format. I'm going to ask the panelists a few questions and they will talk among each other until around 12:40. And then we'll have about 20 minutes for open conversation around questions from the audience. I will have to leave just a few minutes early, and Jessica will take over if the conversation's continuing at that point. We are recording this session, so bear that in mind in terms of how you want to be featured with your questions. And always remember that you can post questions to the chat at any point. You don't have to wait for the open Q&A. We'll be curating the questions and then we can use the questions at that point. But I'd like to get started with our first question for the panelists. Jumping off of the important and revelatory work of Dr. Wilder, What is one of the most important examples of higher education's entanglement with racialized violence that you have researched and that you can share with us today? And why is it important for us to remember?
I'm happy to start off, I guess. Yeah, so I'm an intellectual historian, and so I do a lot like Craig Wilder did with the origin of scientific racism and its impact on American society. So in this sense, this was an incredibly important role that scientific racism, through the academy especially, performed in American society. It basically rationalized all of the most horrific atrocities and acts that the US government had done, from ethnic cleansing and genocide of Native Americans to enslavement of African Americans to the Jim Crow order. Universities were totally complicit in this process. Craig Wilder's book is amazing at showing this from the very beginning of colonial times, but obviously continued on into the 20th century. You think of, for example, anthropology, which as a discipline very much underwrote the Supreme Court decision in Plessy v. Ferguson. And really it was just part of that network that allowed Americans to get away with, rationalize, and justify no matter what sort of racialized violence or other acts that they did. So I'll open up to my other colleagues too. So.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful let in. Look, before I begin talking, I just wanted to say thank you all for having me, especially me coming from Amherst. I'm so sorry that this is being recorded because, I thought I was going to be able to dip over there and, do this without my Amherst colleagues knowing. So now I'm on the interweb forever. So you got me good on that one. You got me good. In seriousness, when we think about colleges and universities, particularly some of these elite colleges and universities, there's a great deal of what we may call violence, but definitely damage to communities of color, particularly Black and Brown communities that could be logged. I appreciate what Dave had just mentioned about this idea of perpetuating a certain kind of white supremacy within the institutions themselves. That is, from these disciplines like psychology or history or whatever it may be, there were early underpinnings of white supremacy that got perpetuated moving forward. But then I'd also say there are physical manifestations of a certain kind of, if you will, violence. So in my books, I've written about the expansion of these institutions into their neighborhoods. And oftentimes, elite institutions find themselves in poverty-stricken neighborhoods that feature Black and Brown people. So when I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about Columbia University as it expanded into West Harlem and now Manhattanville and other spaces. The same could be told of Penn into West Philadelphia. So there used to be a neighborhood called Mantua. Now it's called University City. Do you understand where I'm going? And they're able to do this with the bolstering of the federal, state, and municipal governments and subsidies and all sorts of things like this. You see this in Chicago, all over the United States. So the question remains, how do these institutions edify and create and build rather than tear down when it comes to people of color and particularly Black people in my studies.
So thank you, Professor Bradley. That's a perfect segue. So I am an anthropologist and I've focused therefore in part on relationships, but I'm also a historian. So the impact, whether it's slavery, whether it's Jim Crow, whether it's systemic inequalities, those impacts on social networks of Black families, Black communities, it literally impacts from life to death. As Jackie mentioned at the beginning, some of my research has been on historic African-American cemeteries, specifically here in Virginia. And these cemeteries are at greater risk of vandalism, destruction in the 19th and into the 20th century, grave robbing for anatomical studies. So it's funny, I look at Dr. Wilder's book, and at one point I had made a list of all the institutions that he mentioned in it. And as of course we all know, because we read the book, it's the North, it's the South. This isn't a Mason-Dixon line thing. This isn't a, oh, it only happens in cities. And this is well beyond the stories that most people know, like segregate. I'm from right outside of Chicago, segregated Chicago and violence, or again, our cities, or plantations in rural areas. This permeates this. That's why it's systemic. And that, I think, is actually one of the most important takeaways of any of this research, that every era you see the impact of these inequalities. And so for me, for example, a companion volume that one could write to Dr. Wilder's book, I mean, he focused very much on the individuals enslaved in these places, but it's always one step away from, and how about their spouses that they had been forcibly separated from, who weren't actually technically enslaved by that institution, but that's part of the harm, or their kinship groups, or their communities, their support communities. And unfortunately, that story, it's not just a story connected to the antebellum period. This is also, Reconstruction era, Jim Crow, people trying to get someplace where they aren't facing systemic inequalities. And so they're not being always forced to leave families after slavery, but when you have economic devastation, political devastation, I mean, effectively they are making very difficult choices, and the harm continues.
Thank you. Actually, I think that sets up a really great segue to one of the next questions that we have, which is, you've outlined a variety of ways that institutions of higher education have been implicated in racialized violence that run the gambit from, more famous cases we know of founders, trustees, institutions themselves having owned enslaved African Americans, having been involved in the colonization and dispossession of indigenous peoples and lands, but also to other kinds of harms in terms of participating in racist Supreme Court decisions through testimony, perpetuating logics of white supremacy within the institutions. So how do institutions of higher education go about identifying the communities that have been harmed, precisely when, as you were pointing to, Dr. Rainville, that network can be broader than what you think of as just the this person was enslaved, that there's actually a broader network of concern. How can they identify who's been harmed, and how can one institution begin to measure the extent of harm?
Well, I would just, it takes a lot of time, because it stretches through generations, and it doesn't have one geographical boundary. I mean, I think we can all point to, and including to examples that Dr. Wilder has in the last 10 years or so, the group loosely affiliated universities studying slavery, which is now over, I think, 70 different institutions. And each of them are trying slightly different approaches, but we can think of Georgetown, we could think of University of Virginia. I mean, I was doing work at Sweetbriar College and now at WNL, because it's everything from genealogy to history to sociology, it's ethnohistory, it's community relations, it's trying to build, I think most of our institutions are probably still in the position of building the trust that would be necessary for the community. To put it a different way, as academics, it's fairly easy to create like a research project here to say, okay, this is the history I need to know, this is the context, these are the people, these are the families. But it's the really important part is the level of trust, so that the community wants to be involved, feels like it's not just going to be another moment of being taken advantage of or being somehow studied, as opposed to they are contributors and they are the they are the experts and the sources of information about this harm.
I think you're absolutely right, Professor Rainbow. I would say that I just want to pepper my answer with this is the easiest thing in the world would be to continue to focus on slavery as if it were only slavery that harmed that harmed Black people. I'll speak for Black people. That's a dangerous way of thinking. So I'm thinking about one of the things that I referred to in my research was Bruce Wright up at Princeton University. This was a wonderful Black student who was accepted to Princeton University, I think in the 1930s. And then they found out he was Black and then turned him away and would not allow him to go. Princeton was the last of the Ivy League institutions to admit Black students. That to me is a certain kind of harm that is, I can if I get with my economist friends, I can probably bear out how much money he would have lost from not being able to attend Princeton University and then go on and create a certain kind of network, the network that the professor was talking about. And then the wealth that would have been created, and he would have been able to pass down to his children and grandchildren in that way. So that's one of the dangers of everything is thinking that it stopped at slavery. So when you deny somebody the opportunity to play basketball for I don't know, Dartmouth College, or for when you don't admit students because of their race, you've now done harm in that way. How do we find out? Part of it will require some relationship building. Fordham University has what it's called. I think it's called the Bronx Oral History Project or something along these lines. This is a wonderful opportunity of units like archives and special collections and to be in the vanguard of learning these histories. In some ways it's difficult, but in many ways it's quite simple. If you ask the people who live around these institutions how they've been harmed or helped by the institutions, it won't take long to figure out. It won't take long, and then you can identify people and what to do from there.
Yeah, so I guess all I'd add, I'm kind of distant from, how do these distinct institutions do this important work of identifying specific harms that they can then try to address. But for me, it is, it's a, confounding, because obviously it is such a broad thing. You look at all of America, the grand sweep of American history, and these institutions are just one part of the whole society, which is engaging in various types of discriminations, harassments, harms, and it really is limitless to an extent. And so, I don't know. And I'm also just kind of thinking of it, how much there is no quantitative way to measure these harms when they're psychological, when they're, humanistic, and they just, I don't know. So the big picture is as important as it is for institutions to do this work, I also think it's just so limited way. Like the only way to really tackle these things is at the federal level, to do much more broad pieces of, compensatory legislation and social programs that can at least use the past knowledge to create a far better future and awakened by that, even if, because a lot of these people are no longer here, you're never going to be able to give them real restitution for the vast majority of them. And so I would just hope that the push would be a national one to do as much as we could with the huge resources of the United States government, rather than just, oh, this is what Williams is doing, and now this is what this university is doing. And
yeah, do you think that, Professor Varel, do you think that it almost has to start, in my mind, at an institutional level? Because it's clear to me that don't have me cussing on this panel, but nothing is being done at the federal level to help with the causes of making America straight and right with Black people or with people who have been harmed. So in my mind, what that means is we do these land acknowledgements at these events and things like that. How about we do this? Is people from that from those nations, how about we create an admission system for young people from those nations, where if we took their land, then we can give the education away that we have here at these institutions. In my mind, that's a way of recompense. I had written a small thing in USA Today about higher education and reparations. I think it has to start in spaces like higher education. I think if we wait on the federal government, we will run dry real quick. I think also people have to speak to this in very specific and cut and dry ways. That is, we can't talk about we're hoping and wishing and praying for more Black students without actually saying we want more Black students. And so this is a lot of what's been going on since George Floyd's death and Breonna Taylor. So what that means is we will have to pointedly start recruiting Black students, which is not easy. Which is not easy for these institutions that never had to recruit Black students before. That means hiring Black people. That means, like, so all of this is in some ways nebulous, but in other ways, if we just take one step after the next step, we'll be able to get somewhere with all things.
That's great, Stefan. And yeah, please call me Dave. You don't have to call me Dr. Varel. But yeah, no, I think you're right. And my point wasn't to kind of start at a national level, but just to kind of be hoping that we can, eventually have that as a goal as well. But I think you're absolutely right that all these things, like all movements, they got to start at the very grassroots level to do that kind of thing. And only one other point I'd add at this point, I know some of the other questions we'll get to this, is just elite institutions in general, I think in many ways continue to be part of the problem, right? Rather than sort of public institutions, which are open to a whole set of, they function differently and they serve very different populations. How is an elite institution going to rectify the past when its continuing function is to kind of exacerbate class and other inequalities still, no matter, and so that I think is a problem that we'll talk more a bit here, I'm sure, with Williams, and maybe that will be a less pleasant discussion for some Williams folks, but I do think that is a key part to this too.
Actually, I think that could be a great jumping off point, and you can fold that into the next question a little bit, because, part of what, I think we'd love to know is that in the work that you've done to uncover the lived experiences of those who in the past were silenced and repressed on account of things that have gone on in these institutions, what have you found to be the most impactful way for an elite institution to not repeat past injustices? Or maybe I should even add, and have you seen that? So
I'll let Lynn and Stefan jump in there. I think they have more experience talking about what institutions have done, whereas me, I've kind of studied more further in the past what they've done really poorly and not well versus what great actions they've done to rectify those things. But I mean, I can come up with some ideas, but.
Well, Stefan put the focus on, you have to have Black students, you have to have Black faculty, you have to have Black staff members and administrators and leaders. And I mean, people have to be in the community. So a lot of my research, I mean, similar to you, Dave, Sweetbriar College had previously been a plantation that at the eve of the Civil War had enslaved over 155 men, women, and children. And my research started, because I'm a historian, far in the past, and then was tracing those families and tracing them into the present, at which point I calculated, as of about a couple of years ago, within the Sweetbriar community, as many as 30% of the hourly workforce was directly descended from the enslaved community, fourth, fifth, sixth, in one case, actually only second generation from people who'd been enslaved. So that's one of the reasons why and also because I'm an anthropologist, I always think of this in terms of whether it's thinking about harm or impact or solutions, community, it's individuals who are harmed, but it's also their families, then it's their community. And then you get up to things that are systemic. So to our earlier discussion about, is it a federal solution first? Is it institutional? Is it local? Is it individual? Is it scholarships one at a time? I'm sure, I mean, all of these levels, all these layers are going to be necessary. So to your point, Jackie, like how are institutions being successful? Well, I'd say it's still very challenging, but whatever it is, you have to have in place admissions policies that are welcoming people. And in the case of Sweetbar, they have continued to now work on recruiting students from the very local, very rural, very local area who themselves are connected to the broad descendant community. And that's just a critical step. You can't do it without people.
Yeah, I think such an excellent point. Some of the things that have worked best have been when working with individuals and groups from the community itself, from these communities themselves. And so that requires, as the other panelists have mentioned, building certain kind of relationships that don't come natural for spaces that concentrate on closing the outside community out, like the external community, keeping the external community out. So one of the things that always strikes me is strange is many of these elite institutions, private ones, find themselves in communities where there are people who can never really actually attend these institutions. All right, fine. So suppose you're like Williams College or Amherst College, and you have a 13% admission rate, which means hardly anybody is coming to these places. That's cool, but should community people feel welcome on campus though? You see, we take up all of these, as to Devarian Baldwin's point, we take up all the good air and water and all the good space with these institutions, these nonprofit institutions, often private institutions, and then not even allow people to come on campus to have their meetings or to have their dances or to play their softball game. That's one way of opening up and showing that you're part of community. I think that's an important element of all of this, is that being part of and in community with people who live in the neighborhoods is one way of easing things. Now, that's not the final answer, of course, but I think that's one way of doing things. The other thing that's really been chafing me recently is it's remarkable how well these institutions have done to create things like Black Studies departments and programs and centers and that sort of thing. But from these very same institutions, you have legislators that who have graduated, who are alumni of these institutions, who will deny all of good science, that will deny all of good humanity in general. So part of that has to do with what do we learn at these institutions. So if we really want to contribute something to make up for the past, to repair the past, then that has much to do with how we educate in the present moment. And so teaching about the things that Lynn and Dave have mentioned, teaching about these things, incorporating them into the community and culture of the institutions is a necessary part of growing and hopefully making our way towards reconciliation with the people that we've harmed.
Great points for both of you. I just want to kind of go from there too. In a way, I guess I have even more kind of pessimistic view about positive change that elite institutions can ever do, precisely because some of the things that you guys have been talking about. But that 13% admission rate, like the whole business model of these institutions is to make it more and more. They want that rate lower and lower. They actively make it so it's most people can't go there. Most people don't even have that opportunity, and that's what makes them elite and gives them prestige. And then also, I love Stefan's point there, just about how, what does an elite institution ultimately do? You could have the greatest scholars there giving you all the most cutting edge research, but too often those degrees just become and access to this network, which is what you get at those schools as much as anything else, of powerful people in powerful places who can get you a powerful position somewhere else in society. And then you're part of, a bank or Congress or something that isn't doing very progressive things. And sadly, even these elite institutions are kind of in this neoliberal model of higher ed these days. You're serving, less than 1% of the population here. How can you ever push for broad progressive change, no matter who you admit into the school, right? It's a small slice of society that will never represent the true diversity, economic class, whatever else. You can't solve the real problem in any significant way in terms of those senses. And I'm not trying to be pessimistic saying that there aren't important things you can still need to do to make your spaces better, to promote change. But I don't think that because of your institutional DNA, you can really challenge the system in a way that you're so much a part of, I would say.
Just looking at the time and what you just said there, I actually think I'm gonna skip ahead and go straight to thinking about this, given the constraints of the institutions we have, both like, what do reparations look like for those who've been impacted by the legacies of slavery, extraction, and exploitation that we've been discussing? What do you think reparations could look like, both in a larger way, but also what could these elite institutions do? What could they look like?
I'll shoot off. I think one of the things that I do believe is reparations is going to be, in some ways, it's going to have to deal with resources, with funds, with money, and that offends the sensibilities of a lot of people because all of a sudden people get dumb. It's hilarious at colleges and universities. They can find anything. Like they can carry decimal points out to 6, 7 places. But when you start talking about repairing for the racism of the past, then everybody is like, I don't know what we can do. How will we find people? It's remarkable in that way. So my point is it's going to be monetary. And what does that look like? That could look like housing. That could look like admissions or scholarships, particular scholarships. That could look like professorships or fellowships along those lines. So all of those things I think are doable for institutions of higher education. I think those are possible. But I also think reparations, what it looks like for a higher education institution, is the ability to push back and fight against some of the blatant ignorance, the blatant ignorance that is driving the anti-intellectual culture of the United States right now. And so people being unafraid to say, yeah, at this college or university, there are people who study critical race theory, and we don't care because we study things at college and university, and that's what we do. And we support those scholars as much as we study the scholars, doing physics and everything else. Teaching young people to be, critical about their own station in life is important. Many of the institutions, these elite institutions, are replicating themselves by admitting the same kind of students decade after decade after decade. If we're serious about this, then we start fishing in different ponds and admitting different kinds of students and allowing for them to thrive in ways that may not be comfortable for the traditional college or university. And that requires resources as well. So that's a certain kind of co-curricular resources and as well as assistance with transitions. So those are ways that I'm thinking about it right
Well, I would echo the part about education, which you would think, because we're all at institutions of higher education, that wouldn't be something we'd have to double down on. that like, as you said, that would actually be part of the job. And of course, many of us are doing that work, but the idea that everyone has now become, that there's no such thing as experts any longer, to put it a different way, yes, everyone, if they put the time into it, could do the work that any of us are doing. But most people haven't put in the work, which means that when they dip into these discussions, I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges I have is helping people understand what is systemic. I mean, because at least for me, when you get down to the hardest level is always going to be individuals. Like, this person suffered harm. Who is responsible? How do we, especially when people, like you were saying, Dave, because I also deal mostly with people who are long dead, you know, instead of going to the philosophical discourse around, yes, what does reparations look like for someone who is deceased? Is it their direct, you know, I mean, you can do a whole philosophical thing here, but as you said in the beginning, Stefan, this isn't just about the antebellum period or people who were enslaved, or even the children of people who were enslaved, or Jim Crow, or the civil rights era, or people who suffered from segregated schooling. Talk about irreparable harm, financial, forget everything else, but just the financial harm of a school that wasn't funded at the equal level of a nearby white school. I mean, today it's the medical, so it is so systemic, and it has the history matters because we haven't fixed this yet as a society, and many people seem to still see this as very individual problems, or problems of individuals, and that is not what this is. So education and the idea of systemic racism, racialized injustice, that to me is critically important.
I'll just make two brief points. One is just to, highlight this one book many of you probably know of, won some awards recently, like William Darity and Kirsten Mullins, From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century, published by UNC Press recently. A great introduction to talking about reparations, and beginning with kind of three parts. First one being acknowledgement, meaning not only kind of acknowledging the harm done to certain people, but also who were the beneficiaries of that harm. And so obviously educational institutions, as Williams is doing through programs like this, is talking about that harm, its role in that harm, acknowledging it. So that is a key part of the process all along. And then of course, getting to the second part of redress, whether it's atonement, forgiveness from victims, or the more difficult restitution, which at one point, I have a quote from that little passage where he says that the restitution involves, for African Americans, would eliminate racial disparities in wealth, income, education, health, sentencing, incarceration, political participation, etc. So really capacious, really the goal you want to fight for, what true change looks like, to actually have an equal society, and what that does. But the second point I just want to make beyond that is just, again, Stefan's point I think is really crucial about how money, like power is tied to money, and that's part of this. So we look at places like Harvard and Princeton, the Ivy Leagues, right? We have these endowments, which they're managing like hedge funds, basically. And that's, as we now know, is Wilder Tract, right? This was all part of specific people, slavery, exploiting, killing people to get that money, which is now giving them ongoing advantage to continue to dominate in different ways. So I don't know, on a broad-based level, I think fairness, the most just thing is to just take away those endowments, or tax them like crazy, or do something to take that wealth and put them in other places, and in institutions that serve the public more broadly and aren't these elite institutions. But that's just one point there. I'll leave it.
Well, I want to thank you so much. So I want to open up to questions from the audience. I can go ahead and direct your attention to the first question that came into the chat while you were talking. And that's, this is from Jaden, as he's a student here. How can we hold these institutions accountable When pushed for change, institutions justify their lack of movement by saying progressive changes go against institutional policies, or when the institutions agree to make small changes, but only through years-long complex bureaucratic processes.
Well, it looks like Amherst College hasn't cornered the market on genius students. I see. Wonderful question, Jaden, and it's pretty apparent that you picked up on the technique of institutions to remain, in the status quo. That is, there's a certain bureaucracy to all of this, and so one of the things that works in my mind particularly well is pointing out when we're able to move around bureaucracy to get things done. So say for instance, when a pandemic hits, all of a sudden people can start thinking innovatively and know what to do about things. And I think that that's an important element of things. Now, are you able to go through all the same channels that you went through before to make these changes? Perhaps not. Perhaps not, but you made the decision based on what's pressing. When we're talking about racial histories and racism and how to steer away from these things, you can't get a different product doing the same things that you've always done. So if we're using the same commissions, the same committees, the same way of making decisions that we've always made, then we'll get the same kind of answers always. So one of the things that I think is essential is for these institutions to create and listen to groups of progressive students and alumni. This is so crucial because students have quite a bit of power. I'd like to tell Jaden that your institution will listen to you before oftentimes listening to the professional staff and faculty. Students have quite a bit of power. And what I wanted to say is that students, when they become alumni, the power increases in many ways. And so using that power to say precisely what you want and what you think is right will help these institutions move forward. Big secret is this. Many of these institutions don't know how to make these major changes. They don't know how, and if they do know how, they're waiting for somebody to push them to do it because institutions don't change on their own. They have to be agitated. So I would say it's important that young people continue to organize, that young people continue to provide ideas for these institutions to change, and that they engage with alumni. To push these institutions in directions that maybe they've never gone before.
I was waiting to see if anyone else had anything. You can use the raise hand function. You can post to the chat if you have questions. I'm gonna now also try to combine some things that appeared in the chat. Some of them just affirmations, but things that I think are questions from Jaleesa Jolly, also Williams alum, but also, as I understand, a professor at Amherst. So yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So a couple of things that I think have come up in her remarks that relate to questions is the recognition that, yeah, we these institutions actually do have power and money. So, what are some of the things that could be done, and what are some of the ways to be more imaginative about the strategies that can be employed to solve these problems and to use that power?
So I'll just say one thing quick. I know that Lynn and Stefan have far better specific ideas on this, as I've said, but again, I think it comes down to, it's important to put elite institutions within the landscape of higher education. You look at my institution. Okay, I'm an adjunct. I teach part-time at an open access college. that's where true diversity lies in the first place, racial, class, and otherwise. I get paid not a livable wage without benefits to do the work I do teaching. If you're talking about serving a broader public, a more diverse public, you're going to find it in community colleges, you're going to find it in these open access institutions, which do try to give a specific leg up to some of these folks in these communities. That's something that an elite institution cannot ever do, because it is against the business model of the school to be selective. So you can take a top percent of each community, and that can have a real effect by having students, of color who've gone to those places use that power and network to then fight for broader changes, but you're never going to reach the broader public. So I always support far more public oriented institutions. And so, again, it's not exactly a likely scenario, but using that endowment, using the monies that these elite institutions have just kind of held on to, which is enriched by the tax benefits that they have from the government, redistributing that to communities schools that actually serve the public in far broader ways. But I'll let the others.
Well, building on something that Stefan said before about why don't these institutions let communities, play sports on their fields or use their spaces to host community events. I mean, I think one way to think of this is, so these elite institutions obviously have invested a lot of money in their infrastructure over a very long time. And then for me, in part, it's how can they be a better partner with communities? And like you said, Dave, I mean, it's gonna be a challenge. The idea of admissions, because it's the antithesis of a business model, that's tricky. But so as a first step, the idea of most of the institutions I've been at, both public and private, they've had better technology, for example, than the surrounding community. And especially over the last 20 years, 20 years ago, it would have been as simple as providing Wi-Fi spots. Now things are changing a little bit, but there are so many resources that any of us, having access to some of these books that you were mentioning, Dave, there are so many ways now because these institutions have money and the resources they have that even community colleges don't necessarily have. So how to turn that into a hub of more partnerships and sharing these resources and the expertise that many of the faculty, staff, and students are developing. I mean, that is as Stefan pointed out in the beginning, that has a monetary value. Not, unfortunately, Dave, I mean, not always for each of us in each of our positions at every moment, but it does have an economic impact, the education that all of us have that we are continuing to share and hopefully teach our students. So and if you could share that knowledge in a welcome way with the community, not in a hands down way of and now we're going to teach you, no one needs that, but share in a way that what does the community need? Does the community need legal services or legal training so that they can, whether it's impact of redlining, again, any of these 21st century economic impacts, maybe that's something you could do that would literally change someone's life. So something like that.
Stefan, you're all right. Didn't know if you wanted to jump in. Yeah. So we have a pair of questions that have come in from Ali Corey, colleague of mine working the Davis Center. And, I think they're really related directly to how we can imagine reparations for the Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohicans, whose occupied homelands Williams College sits upon. And, there are two different questions, some that might be a little nitty-gritty for you to be able to answer, but I think you can speak to in broader strokes from what you know. And that would be one, what are the sort of necessary administrative steps at Williams or places like Williams, I would say, to start a program for members of the Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohicans, like what is in existence at Miami University, Ohio, where tuition is covered, direct support is provided to students who are members of the tribe. What does that take? And then I think the second question, it's related to that, and it's a sort of also bigger in terms of thinking about what we mean by reparations when, we have this land acknowledgement, we're not giving back the land. So what, would there be ways to link financial support if we're not going to give back the land? What are the ways of linking financial support to the assessed value of the land that Williams, and I'd add other institutions, claim ownership over?
It seems to me that there are models. There are models, of course, for this, but I never want to underestimate the power of will. These institutions do whatever they want to do. I think about the Manhattan Project at Columbia University. Like people figured out a way to create an atom bomb. Like they figured out how to do that. We can figure this out. Like we can figure this out at these institutions, and there are ways to do it. And so, to me, I think that's when you talk about the Mohegan people. There is a way to directly do that and maybe reach out to people from the nation who will be able to assist with this. But it's a matter of will. And I think that that's at the base of all of this, the willpower to do it. And so if we don't do it now, though, one of the things that I would wish and hope for is that we take down all of these diversity statements and all of these anti-racism statements and that sort of thing. It's quite unnerving to see all these things, but not see the will and the resources being put into repairing for the harm that we've made.
I would add, in terms of the creativity that's going to be necessary to do this right, some of the institutions on the Eastern Seaboard, which are the ones I'm more familiar with, who have tried things like scholarships for any community that's been harmed in the past by the institution. That, I'm not saying that's not an important step, but of course that does presume that, again, that level of trust has somehow been rebuilt at some moment where the people who were harmed by an institution would in any way want to attend that specific institution. So again, back to the idea of how systemic this is and what sort of these solutions will have to look like. It's that idea of redress or restitution, like how have people been harmed? And as we pointed out throughout this conversation, it's economic, political, emotional, family. I mean, unfortunately, it's in all these categories. And so then sometimes helping to repair that in the present, it maybe seems kind of counterintuitive, but it's actually not connected to it's not a solution that would set up an expectation that, and yes, now you will come to, like, we will provide the solution directly, or you will come to us. Because sometimes that not only is that trust not there, but it's additional trauma. So I think, again, as Stefan was saying all along, I think creativity, I mean, we need more conversations about what is more long lasting, what is more available. I mean, I get stuck in part because as an anthropologist, when I hear people talk about descendants, the truth is, for any one of us from the past, we have like maybe 10,000 living people at any moment who could count as our descendants, which on one hand shows the amount of harm. And on the other hand, from an institutional perspective, it's the scale at which this impacts. We have to think at that scale. That's the creative solutions. That scholarships are part of it. And it absolutely, it does involve money. I mean, that it is about money, but it's a question about how to deploy the money. I mean, I think of some of the institutions that are trying to do the right thing. They're talking about reparations, they've some of them have really raised, all things considered, actually large in the tens of millions of dollars. But again, you think of this, how many people have been harmed, and you start, then it becomes like this pie. And then at an individual level, how does that, for that individual, even $5,000, $10,000, $50,000, that's not, to your point, Steph, in the beginning, economists, what the median income here, we're talking about a difference of more than $100,000 per person.
Okay.
Sorry, I was actually just going to let you all know that I'm handing things over to Jessica Dermisich, who should pin herself on screen to continue handling questions and direct your attention to some important remarks that have come in from the on the chat from Jaleesa, Jaden, and Allie. So thank you all very much, and take care.
Thank you. Jaleesa, you had your hand up. Would you like to ask a question, or do you want me to repeat what you wrote in chat or formulate that?
That's totally fine. Please continue. And thank you for this wonderful conversation. It was primarily a question about alumni engagement, but I think it was touched on, and I'm happy to dive further into it tomorrow. Thank you. Okay.
Does anyone else have a question? Feel free to raise your hand, or I can formulate one from the chat. Jaleesa wrote in the chat that emphasis is on will, power, and resources, on creativity, on engaging alumni meaningfully. Wine and cheese is cute, but we compare that with strategic organizing and sustained equity action. That's a really excellent statement. And Jaden went on to say in the chat, in fact, collaboration with members of the Stockbridge-Muncie community, students and faculty have already identified ways in which Williams College can start to provide institutional support and reparations. Where we're getting stuck is how to get the institution to agree and follow through with these solutions, which goes to how the year-long question and how to push these policies through. Does anyone have, Lynn, Stefan, or Dave, do you have responses to that? Or does anyone else want to? We have 3 minutes left. Someone ask another question. This is such a great conversation. Oh, another message. Okay, I know, Allie, you don't have another question, but your hand is still up, I'm presuming.
Sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Yeah, no, I just wanted to add the thing about, figuring out ways, being creative. I think that the point about folks not wanting to come back to this land, which is a historical land of trauma enacted by the institution, there are just ways around this. Like, you just design a policy that would support something else, whether that's linked to the amount of the land or whatever, ultimately trying to figure out ways not to tie whatever support is being given to normative settler senses of what progress is or what support should be or what success is, but granting a certain amount of sovereignty. The nations should have their sovereignty, enshrined in law, and then there may be ways for us to support that rather than drawing people into, a community that's history is linked with displacement, genocide, and all of that.
I really like your point. I think what we're speaking to is supporting the institutions, figuring out a way to support the institutions that have supported the harmed people. So if this is a place that could potentially be a point of trauma, then we can support Native serving institutions, right? Indigenous population serving institutions. The same with HBCUs. We could do the same in those ways. And there have been these throughout history. There have been these connections and networks between, at least what I know, between these institutions like Amherst, Williams, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and HBCUs that would allow for things. The one thing I would say in the interest of time is that the worst thing that could happen is for institutions like an Amherst or Williams or whatever it is to feel as though they are not agents in this call for reparations. That is, that all of this is just happening to these institutions. No, there's much that can be done, and it will be difficult because it will require putting a mirror to the institutions and then acting on that. And so that's the tough part. But I think interested individuals should continue to push. But I think it's important that these institutions not forget that they are agents, and they have been agents in the harm, and they can be agents in the repair just the same. It's the same amount of energy, just displaced in different ways.
That is very well said, Stefan. We are at 1 p.m. and I want to thank wonderful Jackie, Stefan, Lynn, and Dave for this conversation. It was really inspiring. There was a few more questions in chat or just some statements. I will perhaps pass those along to you as I continue to curate them. And we have an alumni conversation tomorrow. Jalisa will be there. I'll be led by Assistant Professor Siobhan Robinson tomorrow. We hope you can join us for that as well. And if you have further questions, please email me. I will forward them along to the panelists, or you can forward them to Anthony or Jackie too. Thank you so much. This was really great.